Most people are going to lose today. Not because they are lazy, not because they are unintelligent, not because life dealt them a bad hand or the system was rigged against them or they never got the right opportunity. They are going to lose because they are thinking the exact same way they thought yesterday, and the day before that, and the year before that, reacting instead of reading, feeling instead of calculating, waiting on emotion to point them in a direction when emotion has never once in the history of human achievement built a life that was worth envying. They are running on a brain that was never deliberately trained, never intentionally upgraded, never brought under the kind of disciplined mental order that separates the people who shape circumstances from the people who are shaped by them, and they will spend the rest of their lives wondering why nothing seems to work out the way they planned. You have been outthought, outmoved, and outpositioned by people who understood something you were never taught. That the brain is a machine, and machines that are not trained break down, slow down, and get replaced. This is the truth that drifters and victims never learn, and strategic minds never forget. That thinking is a skill, that focus is a discipline, that the difference between the person who consistently wins in relationships, in business, in every room they walk into, and the person who consistently watches someone else take what they wanted, is not talent, not luck, not genetics. It is the deliberate, consistent, relentless engineering of how the mind operates under pressure, under temptation, under the manipulations of people who have already done the work you have not yet started. Machiavelli understood this over 500 years ago, writing from a prison cell in Florence after the Medici had stripped him of power, tortured him, and thrown him into the dark to rot. And what he produced in that darkness was not a complaint, not a prayer, not a plea for mercy, but a cold, precise, extraordinarily clear map of how power actually moves through the world, how the mind that is trained for strategy survives and thrives where the untrained mind collapses and surrenders. By the time this is over, you will know exactly how to begin the process of engineering your mind into the kind of instrument that outthinks, outmaneuvers, and outlasts every person in the room who is still running on instinct. And you will understand why everything you were taught about thinking has been keeping you smaller than you were built to be. Before anything else, if you have been watching this channel for a while, or if this is your very first time here and something in those opening words landed somewhere real inside you, take 5 seconds right now and do something that actually matters. Hit that like button, because what you are about to learn deserves to reach the people who need it most. And the algorithm only shows this to more people when you tell it that it was worth watching. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell, because every single video on this channel is built to give you the kind of psychological knowledge that changes how you think, how you move, and how you make decisions for the rest of your life. And here's what this channel wants to know right now. Where in the world are you watching this from? And what time is it where you are? Drop your city, your country, and the time in the comments below. Whether it is 6 in the morning before anyone else in your house is awake, or midnight when the rest of the world has already given up on the day, the fact that you are here, choosing to think at a deeper level than the people around you, says something about who you are. Say it out loud in the comments. The community here comes from everywhere, and that matters. So tell us where you are, tell us what time it is, and then stay locked in, because what comes next will change how you use your mind forever. Here is the reality that most people will spend their entire lives refusing to accept, not because they cannot understand it, but because understanding it means accepting responsibility for every outcome they have been quietly blaming on something outside themselves. And that reality is this: your brain, in its default, untrained state, is not built for strategy. It is built for survival. It is built to react, to seek comfort, to avoid the kind of sustained cognitive discomfort that genuine strategic thinking always demands, to take shortcuts, to fall for familiar patterns, to believe what feels right rather than what is accurate, to prioritize the opinion of the crowd over the evidence of its own careful analysis. This is not a character flaw. This is biology. This is the product of hundreds of thousands of years of evolutionary pressure that needed the average human to make fast decisions in dangerous environments, not slow, precise, multi-layered strategic calculations in complex social and professional landscapes. The reactive person, the one who shoots off the first response that forms in their chest, who lets insult trigger retaliation before a single second of thought has intervened, who confuses emotional intensity with clarity, who mistakes being loud for being right. This person is not broken. They are simply unengineered. They are running on the factory settings of a nervous system that was never asked to be anything more than fast. And in a world where everyone around them is also running on factory settings, that used to be enough. It is not enough anymore. It has not been enough for a very long time. Research from the Center for Brain Health at the University of Texas at Dallas, published in Frontiers in Systems Neuroscience, makes the stakes of this devastatingly clear. When participants were trained in what researchers called strategic attention, integrated reasoning, and innovation, the three foundational pillars of genuine high-level thinking, they showed measurable gains not just in abstract cognitive performance, but in real-world decision-making, in the ability to cut through irrelevant noise and identify what actually matters, in the capacity to generate interpretations and solutions that untrained minds simply could not see. The brain, treated as a machine that can be deliberately upgraded, becomes a machine that outperforms the brains around it, not because the person is smarter, but because they chose to train what others chose to leave on default. Machiavelli called the untrained mind the mind of the vulgar, and he used that word with precision, not contempt. The vulgar mind, in his framework, is the one that is taken in by appearances, that reacts to the surface of things, that allows the emotional charge of a moment to override the cold clarity of strategic analysis, that says what it feels before it has assessed what is true and what is useful and what is dangerous to say out loud. He wrote in The Prince that people are by nature fickle, and that the leader who depends on the fickleness of people rather than on the architecture of deliberate strategy will always end up at the mercy of circumstances rather than in command of them. He was not wrong in the 16th century. He is not wrong now. The person who has failed to train their mind is the most predictable person in any room. You can read them from across a hallway. You know how they will react when challenged. You know how they will behave when flattered. You know which buttons to press and what comes out when you press them. And more importantly, anyone in that room who has done the work of mental training knows it too. And the people who have done that work are, in the kindest possible reading of the situation, choosing whether to use that knowledge for your benefit or their own. The first mechanism by which the untrained mind guarantees its own defeat is one that almost no one ever names directly, because naming it would require the kind of honest self-confrontation that the untrained mind is specifically wired to avoid. And that mechanism is this: the untrained mind cannot separate what it feels from what is true. Neuroscience has been saying this with increasing precision for decades. The prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for planning, for consequence assessment, for the kind of deliberate, controlled, forward-thinking cognition that strategic behavior requires, and the amygdala, the brain's ancient threat detection system, the seat of fear and anger, and the fight-or-flight responses that kept your evolutionary ancestors alive. These two systems are in constant competition for command of your behavior, and peer-reviewed research published in leading neuroscience journals has established clearly that under conditions of stress, under pressure, under the emotional heat of a conflict or a challenge or an insult, the amygdala fires faster, wins more often, and sends the prefrontal cortex offline before it has had a chance to weigh in. Anyone who has never deliberately trained this system is, in the most literal neurological sense, being governed by a system that predates rational thought by millions of years, making the most important decisions of their life. What to say, what to do, what to reveal about themselves, from the most primitive part of their brain, while the sophisticated architecture of strategic cognition sits dormant and waiting for a moment of calm that never quite arrives. The trained mind is a different machine entirely. Research on individuals with high self-control, published in Scientific Reports in 2025, found that these individuals demonstrated not just lower emotional reactivity in challenging situations, but stronger and more sustained functional connectivity between the amygdala and the prefrontal regions, meaning the strategic, rational brain was not just available in these individuals, it was physically more connected to the system generating the emotional signal, making it faster to engage, more reliable, more capable of intercepting the reactive response before it became a behavior that could not be taken back. This is not something you either have or you do not. This is something that is built deliberately, the same way a muscle is built, through repeated, intentional effort against resistance, through training under the exact conditions that normally send the amygdala into overdrive, through the practice of pausing where the default system would immediately react, and choosing deliberately where the untrained brain would react on instinct. Machiavelli saw this clearly in the leaders he observed and the ones he studied through history. The prince who could not control their reaction was a prince who had handed every adversary a roadmap. Because the moment you let someone know how to make you angry, how to make you afraid, how to make you desperate, you have given them the most valuable intelligence they could ever have about you. And the ruler of the room is not the one with the most passion, but the one with the most composure. Here's the second thing the untrained mind does that hands its power away to everyone paying attention. It shows everything it knows before it needs to. Most people talk too much, not because they are stupid, because the untrained brain experiences silence as a social threat, as rejection, as disapproval, as the kind of gap in conversation that must be filled immediately or something will go wrong. And so it fills the gap every time with opinions and intentions and information and plans and feelings that were never going to help them and were always going to help the person listening. Machiavelli was precise about this. He understood that the moment you declare your intentions, you have given everyone around you the ability to position themselves against those intentions before you have even begun executing them. He wrote that everyone sees what you appear to be, but few experience what you really are. Meaning that the person who controls what they reveal controls how they are perceived, and the person who controls how they are perceived controls what others expect of them. And the person who controls what others expect of them walks into every situation with the most valuable of all strategic assets, which is the advantage of surprise. The modern psychology of power bears this out in every domain it has been studied. In negotiation research, it is established that the party who speaks first, who volunteers their position before hearing the other side's, who shows their hand before the hand needs to be played, consistently underperforms the party who listens longer, asks more, reveals less, and moves only when they have accumulated enough intelligence to move decisively. In social hierarchies, the person who explains their every decision, who justifies their every position, who defends themselves against every perceived slight, signals something that the person above them in the room's unspoken power structure reads instantly. They signal insecurity, which is the announcement that they do not fully believe in what they are saying and are hoping that external validation will shore up the gap. And that signal, once sent, is not something you can unsend. What the trained mind has learned, and what most people never do, is to be genuinely comfortable in silence. Not the uncomfortable silence of someone who has nothing to say, but the chosen silence of someone who is processing at a level the room cannot see, gathering information that the room is freely providing, and waiting for the precise moment when speaking will do exactly what they need it to do, and nothing more. In a world of people who cannot stop talking, the person who speaks less and says more is the person everyone ends up listening to, not because they demanded attention, but because they made their words worth attending to by rationing them with care. Begin training this today. The next time you feel the impulse to fill a silence, sit inside it for 3 seconds longer than is comfortable. Notice what comes up in you. Notice what the other person does when the silence is not immediately rescued. What they do in that 3 seconds will tell you more about what they actually think than anything they were going to say to cover it. The third mechanism that keeps the untrained mind permanently behind is the most painful one to name, because it strikes at something people have been told is a virtue their entire lives. And that mechanism is this. The average person is making almost all of their most consequential decisions from inside a state of emotional captivity and calling it instinct. Gut feeling, they call it. Knowing. Reading the room. And sometimes, for people with genuine pattern recognition developed through experience, It is exactly that. But for the untrained mind, what presents as gut feeling is almost always the amygdala running an old emotional program. A program written by past pain, past rejection, past humiliation, past fear, and projecting that program onto present circumstances with a confidence that bears no relationship to its accuracy. The cognitive bias research of Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, whose work over decades fundamentally altered how psychologists understand human decision-making, established with meticulous rigor that the human brain is not a rational instrument that occasionally makes emotional errors. It is an emotional instrument that occasionally engages rational analysis, and that under conditions of pressure, fatigue, or high emotional stakes, the rational analysis is the first thing to go offline. Confirmation bias, where the mind seeks evidence that confirms what it already believes and discards evidence that challenges it. Reactive devaluation, where a proposal or idea is dismissed purely because it comes from someone perceived as an opponent. Tunnel vision under pressure, where the mind narrows its focus so severely that obvious solutions sitting just outside the frame become completely invisible. These are not rare glitches. These are the default operating behaviors of the unengineered human brain, running in the background of every conversation, every decision, every evaluation of risk, every relationship. And the person who has not deliberately trained their mind to catch and override these patterns is making major life decisions inside a cognitive fog they cannot see because they are standing inside it. Machiavelli's framework for avoiding this was built on a principle that sounds almost brutally simple until you try to actually do it. He argued that the strategic mind must always study the actual nature of the circumstances rather than the nature it wishes the circumstances had, that it must read the world as it is rather than as it would prefer it to be, that the single most dangerous cognitive error a person in a position of power can make is to mistake a comfortable illusion for an accurate map. In The Prince, he wrote about this as the difference between the armed visionary and the unarmed one. The visionary who has the structural support to enforce their new reality, and the visionary who relies only on persuasion, on charm, on goodwill, on the belief that people will simply stay convinced, once convinced. The unarmed visionary always fails, he argued, not because they lack intelligence or vision, but because they have mistaken the appearance of agreement for the fact of it. And when circumstances shift and the goodwill evaporates, they have no architecture beneath the agreement to hold it together. In modern terms, this is the person who builds relationships on assumption rather than observation, who hires on charm rather than evidence, who invests on hope rather than analysis, who trusts the narrative they constructed about a situation rather than the data the situation is actually generating, and who then experiences the collapse of that assumption as betrayal, as bad luck, as proof that the world is unfair, rather than as the entirely predictable outcome of a mind that chose comfort over clarity. Training the brain to outthink the room is not a single decision. It is a system, and the system has specific mechanics that the research makes clear, and those mechanics can be built by anyone willing to accept that the building will be uncomfortable before it becomes effortless. The first mechanic is what researchers at the Center for Brain Health called strategic attention, the deliberate, trained capacity to filter out what is irrelevant and hold focus exclusively on what is actually important in any given situation. This sounds obvious until you examine how genuinely rare it is in practice. The untrained mind, exposed to a complex situation, absorbs everything with equal weight. The surface drama, the emotional noise, the irrelevant details that are interesting but meaningless, and ends up with a cluttered picture from which any clear strategic read is nearly impossible. Strategic attention is the discipline of asking, before anything else, what actually matters here, and then holding that question against every piece of information the situation generates, ruthlessly filtering out the theatrical and the distracting to keep the signal clean. In a conflict, the untrained mind gets captured by the emotion of the exchange. The strategically attentive mind asks what outcome this other person is actually trying to produce, what they are trying to protect, what they are afraid of revealing, and what the real map of this situation looks like beneath the performance of it. Machiavelli built his entire career in Florentine politics on this capacity, while other advisors were captivated by the spectacle of court life, by reputation, by gossip, by the performance of loyalty. He was reading the actual movement of power beneath the surface of those performances, watching where resources moved, where allegiances shifted, where fear was being masked by confidence, and where strength was being masked by humility, and making his calculations from that undecorated reality, rather than from the theater that surrounded it. In your life, begin building this today by taking any complex situation you are currently navigating and asking one question about it that you have not yet asked. Not, what do I feel about this situation, but what is this situation actually doing, and to whose benefit is it actually moving? The answer that emerges when you hold that question long enough will almost always surprise you, and that surprise is the distance between where you were thinking and where you need to be. The second mechanic of the trained mind is what the research calls integrated reasoning, the capacity to synthesize information from multiple sources, multiple perspectives, multiple time horizons, and produce from that synthesis a single, clear, actionable understanding rather than the fragmented, contradictory, emotionally colored picture that the untrained mind generates from the same information. Most people process one thing at a time. They look at a situation from their perspective, they form a judgment, and that judgment becomes the lens through which all subsequent information is filtered and distorted. The person with integrated reasoning looks at the same situation from their own perspective first, then deliberately inhabits the perspective of every other significant party involved, not as an exercise in empathy, though that is a useful side effect, but as a strategic intelligence-gathering operation, understanding that every party in a complex situation has a logic to their behavior, and that if you can map that logic accurately, you can predict their moves before they make them, position yourself ahead of outcomes before they materialize, and read the chessboard rather than reacting to individual pieces. This is precisely what Machiavelli meant when he wrote that the prince must be both a lion and a fox. The lion to deal with threats that come directly, the fox to move through the complexity that surrounds them. The lion only is a person who can only respond with force when challenged. The fox only is a person who can only maneuver when not directly confronted. The prince who is both is the one who reads the entire landscape, who knows when raw strength is the answer, and when it would be wasted or counterproductive, who has mapped the situation completely enough to know which tool to reach for before the moment of decision demands it. In practice, integrated reasoning looks like this. Before you make any significant move, before the conversation, before the negotiation, before the decision, you sit with the situation and you map every party involved, their interests, their fears, their likely responses to each of your possible actions, and the second and third order consequences of each of your options. You do not do this quickly. You do not do this in the emotional heat of the moment. You do it in the quiet that the strategically sovereign mind has learned to create deliberately, because clarity does not live in the noise, and the untrained mind almost never leaves the noise long enough to find it. There is a particular version of this exercise that changes everything when it becomes habit. Before any high-stakes interaction, you write down, physically write, because the act of writing forces the brain to process with more precision than simply thinking. 3 things. What you want from this interaction, what the other person almost certainly wants, and what the gap between those two positions looks like, and what it would take, specifically and concretely, to build a bridge across that gap that serves both interests, rather than demanding one side capitulate entirely. Most people enter significant conversations armed only with the first item on that list, what they want, and then wonder why the conversation ends without it. The person who has done the full map walks in already 3 moves ahead, already holding the shape of a solution that the other person did not know they were looking for, already positioned not as an adversary demanding something, but as the person who figured out how everyone gets somewhere better than where they started. This is what Machiavelli called the capacity to be both feared and loved, not by performing both simultaneously, which is impossible, but by being the person in any situation who has mapped the terrain so completely that they can offer something real, something genuinely valuable, without appearing weak or desperate, without revealing the full architecture of their thinking, and without needing the validation of the other person's agreement to feel certain in themselves. The prince who can do this does not need to demand loyalty. Loyalty flows toward competence the way water flows downhill, not because anyone decided to allow it, but because the physics of the situation make it inevitable. The third mechanic of the trained mind is the one Machiavelli would have called the capacity to read fortune, and what modern psychology calls adaptability. The willingness and the ability to update your strategy when new information makes the old strategy obsolete. To hold your plans with enough looseness that they can be revised without the revision feeling like failure. The rigid mind, and rigidity is almost always a product of ego rather than intelligence, is the mind that commits to a position and then defends that position against all incoming evidence, because updating the position would mean admitting that the original position was wrong, and the untrained ego has decided that being wrong is too costly to survive. Machiavelli wrote about this as one of the primary causes of the downfall of rulers, he observed. Not stupidity, not lack of resources, but the unwillingness to read changed circumstances and adjust accordingly. The commitment to a strategy that had worked before and therefore felt like it should work again, regardless of what the actual current situation was calling for. He also wrote that it is a common fault not to anticipate storms when the sea is calm, meaning that the strategically trained mind does not wait for a crisis to begin thinking about what to do in a crisis, but uses the calm periods to map the worst-case scenarios, prepare the contingencies, identify the vulnerabilities that an adversary or an adverse circumstance could exploit, and build the responses before they are needed, rather than improvising them in the chaos of the moment when the amygdala has hijacked the prefrontal cortex and cognitive performance has collapsed to a fraction of what it is under normal conditions. Research on decision-making under stress, published in peer-reviewed journals examining what cognitive scientists have called the stress-induced deliberation to intuition model, establishes that stressful conditions push the brain from deliberate, analytical, prefrontal-driven decision-making toward fast, amygdala-driven heuristic shortcuts, and that this shift produces systematic errors in judgment that would not occur in a calm state. The person who has never stress-tested their strategic thinking, who has only ever made their plans in comfortable conditions and never rehearsed them against adversarial pressure, will find that those plans dissolve exactly when they are needed most, because the mind executing them has not been trained to maintain strategic clarity under the conditions that are actually going to challenge it. A mind that has been properly engineered prepares for the storm while the sea is still. It games out the difficult conversations before they happen. It stress tests the assumptions that underlie its most important decisions before committing to them. It identifies the emotional triggers that have historically hijacked its strategic functioning and builds protocols, not just good intentions but actual practiced protocols, for intercepting those triggers before they take over. Call it what it is. Engineering, not paranoia. And engineers do not build bridges and then hope they hold. They test for failure before the bridge is open to traffic. There is a specific practice that Machiavelli employed throughout his life that the modern strategic mind should steal without hesitation. And that practice is the systematic study of other people's patterns before their patterns become your problem. Machiavelli's method in The Prince was essentially this. Examine every historical and contemporary example of how people in positions of power actually behaved. Not how they said they behaved, not how they were described by people who had a stake in the description, but how the evidence of their actual choices and their actual outcomes painted an honest picture of their actual psychology. From those patterns, he extracted principles that were not dependent on any individual situation, but were applicable across contexts, because human nature, the engine beneath the behavior, did not change even when the circumstances around it did. You can apply this same method to every person of significance in your life with a precision that will change how you move through relationships. Instead of taking people at face value, instead of accepting the story they tell about themselves and organizing your expectations around that story, begin watching the pattern of their choices over time. Because the pattern of choices is the only honest autobiography anyone ever writes, regardless of what they say about themselves. How does this person behave when they are under pressure and the stakes are real? How do they treat people who cannot do anything for them? What do they do when they are caught between their stated values and their actual self-interest? How quickly do they forgive themselves for things they would never forgive in someone else? The answers to those questions will tell you everything Machiavelli needed to know, whether this is a lion or a fox or an actor playing both, whether the loyalty being offered is structural or conditional, whether the relationship is one where you can operate with genuine openness, or one where strategic reserve is the appropriate position. And armed with those answers, you are never again blindsided by behavior that was always, in retrospect, predictable. Because predictable behavior is never a surprise to a mind that was paying exactly the right kind of attention. There is a specific phrase that lives in the Machiavellian framework that most people quote without understanding its operational depth, and it is this: keep your friends close and your enemies closer. The popularized version of this sounds like paranoia, like the advice of someone who trusts no one and lives in a constant state of defensive suspicion. But the strategic meaning of it is something far more sophisticated. It is the instruction to understand the people who have interests opposed to yours at least as well as you understand the people who are aligned with yours. Because misunderstanding an ally costs you comfort, but misunderstanding an adversary costs you everything. And the only way to avoid misunderstanding an adversary is to study them with the same careful attention you would devote to anyone you genuinely valued. This does not mean pretending warmth you do not feel. It means gathering intelligence. It means asking the questions, not accusatory questions, but the genuinely open, curious questions that make people feel seen and important, and therefore more willing to reveal, that tell you what this person actually wants, what they are actually afraid of, what they actually believe about the situation you both inhabit, and then listening, really listening, with the same strategic attention you are using everywhere else, filtering what you hear for the signal beneath the performance, for the gap between what they say and what the evidence of their behavior already told you, for the place where their story does not quite hold together, and the actual story is trying to emerge. And understand this clearly. None of what Machiavelli practiced was cynicism. Cynicism is the posture of someone who has been hurt and decided that expecting less is safer than being disappointed. What Machiavelli practiced was clear-eyed realism, the willingness to see people as they are, rather than as he wished they were, accompanied by the genuine warmth of someone who understood that human beings, in all their fickleness and self-interest and capacity for both extraordinary loyalty and extraordinary betrayal, are endlessly fascinating and worth understanding deeply. The discipline that holds all of this together, the thing that separates the person who understands these concepts intellectually from the person who has actually engineered them into the operating system of how they live, is the practice that every serious student of strategic thinking throughout history, from Machiavelli to the modern neuroscientists studying the architecture of high performance, has arrived at independently, from different directions, through different methods, and that is this: deliberate, consistent, uncomfortable daily mental practice. Not the comfortable kind. Not the kind that feels good because it confirms what you already think and requires nothing of you that you have not already given. The kind that puts you in contact with the specific cognitive and emotional patterns that are currently limiting your strategic range, and then asks you to operate differently, again and again, until the new behavior has built the neural infrastructure to sustain itself under pressure. The research on deliberate practice, a body of work that extends from the foundational studies of Anders Ericsson through the meta-analyses published in the Journal of Psychological Science that have synthesized findings from over 11,000 participants across music, sport, games, and professional performance, establishes consistently that the difference between expert performance and average performance is not raw talent, but the quality and consistency of structured practice specifically designed to address current limitations rather than rehearse current strengths. World chess champion Magnus Carlsen described this with a precision that applies equally to strategic thinking in any domain, that after thousands of hours of deliberate practice, he no longer saw individual chess pieces but patterns, threats, opportunities, and complex relationships that less experienced players simply could not perceive. The board looked different to him not because his eyes were better, but because his brain had been trained to extract a different level of signal from the same information available to everyone else. The untrained mind practices its strengths. It gravitates toward the things it is already good at because they feel good and confirm a flattering story about itself. The trained mind practices its weaknesses because the weaknesses are where the ceiling is, and raising the ceiling is the only kind of practice that actually matters. In concrete terms, this looks like a daily practice of catching your own reactive patterns before they become behaviors, of noticing the moment you feel the pull of the amygdala, the urge to respond immediately, to defend, to attack, to fill the silence, to reveal the strategy, and pausing deliberately to ask what a mind operating at full strategic capacity would do instead. It looks like a daily reading of history, of biography, of the documented thinking of people who built exceptional strategic capacity over time, not for inspiration, but for intelligence, extracting the operational principles from their experience and testing those principles against your own. It looks like a weekly review of your most significant decisions and interactions, examining them not for whether they felt good, but for whether they were strategically sound, whether you were the best version of your thinking in those moments, or whether the default, reactive, emotional version showed up and cost you something you will not easily recover. There will be days when the amygdala wins. There will be mornings when you wake up inside an emotional state that is louder than your strategy, and days when the reactive version of you shows up in a moment that needed the trained version. Failure is not the right word for it. What it is material. The trained mind does not require perfect performance. It requires honest assessment, continuous adjustment, and the kind of long-term commitment to its own engineering that the comfortable mind finds inconceivable, because it requires too much daily discomfort for rewards that will not arrive until tomorrow. Machiavelli wrote from a prison cell and produced The Prince. He did not need ideal conditions to think strategically. He did not need comfort or freedom or the goodwill of the people who had just tortured him. He needed only a trained mind, and a trained mind is exactly what he had, built over a lifetime of deliberate observation, deliberate study, deliberate practice of seeing the world clearly rather than the way he wished it looked. That is what you are building now. Not in a day, not in a week, but one decision at a time, one pause before the reactive response. One moment of strategic silence where the old version of you would have spoken. One honest review of where your thinking fell short and what it will look like the next time. That version of you, the one that has been reacting instead of thinking, that has been showing its hand before the game demanded it, that has been making decisions from inside emotional states it mistook for clarity. That version does not survive what you are learning today, not because you are tearing it down, but because you are building something over it that renders it obsolete, something stronger and steadier and far more difficult to rattle, something that the people around you will notice before you tell them a single word about it, because the shift in how a trained mind carries itself is not something you can fake and not something that goes unobserved. The strategically sovereign mind walks into rooms differently. It says less and conveys more. It is moved by very little on the surface, not because it feels nothing, but because it has learned the extraordinary discipline of keeping its internal landscape private until privacy is no longer the strategic choice. It studies every person it encounters with genuine curiosity and without the distortion of ego, asking always what is actually true about this person, rather than what would be convenient for it to believe. It plans 3 moves ahead and executes from a position of preparation that the reactive minds around it cannot replicate, because preparation requires the kind of sustained, uncomfortable thinking that the untrained brain finds every possible way to avoid. You are not becoming cold. You are not becoming calculating in the sense of becoming hollow. You are becoming precise. And precision in how you think, how you respond, how you move through the world and through your relationships is not a departure from warmth. It is warmth's most powerful expression. Because the person who thinks clearly enough to actually understand what is happening around them and in the people around them, who is not distorted by ego or panic or the desperate need for approval, who can sit with the truth of a situation without needing to immediately transform it into something more comfortable, This person is the most genuinely useful, most deeply trustworthy, most profoundly impactful presence in any room they walk into. That is what Machiavelli was building. Not a monster. A person who had stripped away the comfortable illusions that most people carry between themselves and the actual reality of the world, and decided to live and think and operate from the undecorated truth of how things work. That clarity was not cruelty. It was the highest form of respect for what is real, and for what you can become when you commit to seeing it. If something in this video struck a nerve, if you heard something that felt less like information and more like a door opening inside you, comment "machine mind" right now. Not for the algorithm, though that does help this reach the people who need it, for you. Because the moment you write those words in a public space, you are doing something the untrained mind almost never does voluntarily. You are declaring, out loud, in front of strangers, the identity you are choosing to build. And declarations like that have a way of making themselves real. And tell us where you are watching from. Drop your city and the time. Whether you are in London at midnight deciding to be different from who you were yesterday, or in Lagos at 6 in the morning giving yourself the first hour of the day before the world gets its hands on you, or in Toronto or Sydney or Atlanta, or anywhere in between. This community spans every time zone and every background. And what connects everyone here is the decision that ordinary thinking is not good enough for the life they intend to build. Subscribe, hit the notification bell. Every video on this channel is research-backed, human-written, and built to give you the psychological tools that the best performing people in the world use. Not as theory, but as working knowledge you can apply the same day you watch it. The machine is already in your head. You just have to train it. Go forth and be a machine mind.